By the time the first snowflakes fell, Isaac Yoder's barn had already begun to lean from the weight of the early blizzard, and his family was still miles away from the nearest neighbor. It would take every ounce of his strength, faith, and trust in the earth beneath him to survive the winter ahead. Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if you believe in the quiet power of faith and community, join us tomorrow for another tale of Amish resilience. The wind had already begun to whip through the gaps in the barn's walls by late November. Isaac Yoder stood alone in the middle of the snow-covered field, staring at the darkening sky. The storm had come early, just as it always did in the rugged hills of Pennsylvania. He could feel the weight of the coming season in the air, heavy with snow and bitter cold. The barn he had spent all year building, his pride and joy, was the one thing between his family and the harsh winter that would soon surround them. The roof, freshly thatched with straw, had already started to sag under the first heavy flakes, a warning Isaac could not ignore. He had worked the wood himself, crafting every beam and board with care, but there was always a sense that it might not be enough. Isaac wiped the cold from his brow, pushing back a strand of gray hair that had slipped from his hat. His mind raced, filled with questions he couldn't answer. Would the barn hold under the weight of this storm? Would the animals stay safe? More importantly, would his family survive the worst of what was coming? His father's words echoed in his mind. "The land will test you, Isaac, but it will also give back what you put into it." Isaac had worked the land for most of his life, with his hands deep in the soil and his heart intertwined with the seasons. But no matter how much effort he put in, the land still had its way of testing him. He had built that barn with everything he had, but now, with the wind howling louder and snow falling harder, he wondered if he had prepared enough. Shifting his gaze from the barn, Isaac looked toward the horizon where his small farmhouse stood, its windows dark against the gathering storm. His wife, Rachel, and their 2 children were still inside, waiting for him to return, unaware of how close the storm was to swallowing them whole. "Rachel will be fine," he whispered to himself, shaking off the creeping fear. He had no choice but to believe that his work, all the slow, deliberate care he'd put into their home and farm, would be enough. The storm, however, wasn't going to wait for his assurances. It came faster than he anticipated, a sweeping, unforgiving wall of wind and snow that forced him to huddle beneath the nearest tree. He had prepared for cold nights like this with thick quilts and wood piled high by the fire. But as the storm's fury grew, so did his doubt. Rachel's voice echoed softly through the small kitchen as Isaac stepped inside. The warmth from the fire was a welcome relief after the biting cold outside. "Isaac, I was beginning to worry," Rachel said, glancing up from the stove where she stirred the soup with a steady hand. Her face, flushed with warmth, looked both strong and tired from the day's work. It had been a long season of preparing for the worst, and now the worst had arrived. But despite the storm raging outside, Rachel's calm seemed like a beacon in the midst of chaos. "I was just finishing up outside, Rachel," Isaac replied, removing his boots and hanging his coat by the door. "The barn's holding, but I'm not sure for how long. The wind's fierce, and the snow's coming down heavy. We might have to stay inside for the next few days." Rachel nodded, her hands never stopping their work. She knew how hard Isaac worked, and she could see the worry in his eyes. But she also knew that fear could only hold them back from what they needed to do. They had weathered many winters together, and though this one seemed fiercer than the last, she was certain of one thing: their faith would carry them through. "Do you think the animals will be all right?" she asked, her voice betraying a softness that Isaac hadn't expected. "They'll be fine. We've done what we can," Isaac replied, though doubt still lingered in his mind. "But we have to be ready for anything." The night stretched long, the wind howling against the thick stone walls of the farmhouse. The sounds of creaking wood and rattling windows kept Isaac from sleep as he lay next to Rachel in their shared bed. Their children slept soundly across the room, unaware of the battle between nature and man that was unfolding outside. In the stillness of the room, Isaac let his mind wander back to the day he had built the barn, each hammer strike and every log carefully placed. It had been the biggest project of his life, a testament to the faith and determination he carried with him. But now, in the quiet darkness, he couldn't help but wonder if it was enough. Rachel's gentle breathing beside him reminded him that they were not alone in this. He had built this life, this home, for moments like this, when the storm was no longer a passing threat, but a test of everything he had ever worked for. The morning light barely penetrated the dense cloud cover when Isaac rose to check the barn. He had not slept much, despite Rachel's quiet presence beside him, and now the storm's fury seemed to have only intensified. Snow piled against the farmhouse windows in thick layers, obscuring everything outside, as if the world had become a canvas of white chaos. Rachel was already up, the fire in the hearth crackling as she prepared breakfast. The scent of fresh-baked bread filled the house, a simple, grounding comfort against the howling wind outside. Isaac couldn't help but appreciate how the warmth of the kitchen made everything feel manageable, as if they could hold their ground against whatever the world threw their way. "Isaac," Rachel's voice called from the stove, her back turned to him as she stirred the soup. "I think we need to move the animals inside. The wind's pushing too hard against the barn and the doors are starting to creak." Isaac turned toward her, his jaw tightening with the weight of her words. "You're right." He knew she was. It was one thing to brace the barn against the storm, but if the wind was finding its way through the walls, then the animals needed shelter. Immediate shelter. The barn wouldn't hold much longer. "I'll get them," he said, pulling on his coat again. He needed to check the barn, to see just how much damage had been done overnight, but he also needed to act quickly, and there was no time to waste. He stepped outside, the icy wind slapping him across the face with every step. The snow, now thick as cotton, swirled in the wind, cutting across his cheeks. He pulled his scarf tighter, eyes squinting, as he neared the barn. The barn was there, still standing, but barely. The roof was sagging now under the weight of the snow, and the outer walls were creaking, bending inwards with every gust. The doors, once strong and sturdy, had bowed inward, their frames showing signs of stress. Isaac's heart sank as he pushed open the door, his breath catching at the sight inside. The horses were pacing nervously, their breath rising in heavy clouds in the damp air. One of the cows had slipped in the snow and was lying down, unable to rise. He cursed under his breath and rushed to the cow's side. "Come on, girl," he muttered, gently pulling on the reins to coax the animal up. She was heavy with cold and fear, and for a moment Isaac wondered if he had made the wrong decision by trusting the barn to withstand such a storm. But he couldn't afford to think about that now. He had to act. Isaac scrambled around, securing the barn doors with iron brackets and pulling the animals together in the farthest corner of the barn. He kept his movements quick but deliberate, ensuring that every creature had some shelter from the wind. As the storm raged on, Isaac realized the worst was yet to come. The cold was not just an inconvenience. It was a force that demanded respect. And in this moment Isaac realized he was only one man against something far greater. The storm, like all things in life, would not be tamed. By afternoon the snow had turned into a relentless, blinding blizzard. Isaac had managed to get the animals settled, but the storm was only intensifying. The snow piled up so quickly that it covered the barn's doorstep, trapping them inside for the time being. The wind howled outside like a wild creature, scratching at the wooden walls with its sharp claws. Inside, the warmth from the fire in the hearth kept the house bearable. But Isaac knew that warmth wasn't the same as survival. In the face of this relentless cold, it felt fragile, like something that could be extinguished in an instant. He was no longer sure what was stronger, his resolve to survive or the storm's power to break him. Rachel was preparing another meal, her brow furrowed as she worked. Her hands moved like clockwork, kneading dough and stirring the simmering soup, but there was an edge to her movements, a quiet sense of urgency that Isaac had never seen before. She was a woman of faith, of calm assurance, but today even she had a hint of concern in her eyes. "Isaac," she said, looking up briefly from the stove, "we might need to dig out the firewood before dark. If the snow keeps falling like this, we won't be able to get to it tomorrow." Isaac nodded, his stomach tightening. The firewood was stacked outside, protected by the small shed, but with the snow drifting deeper with every hour, getting to it was going to be a challenge. "Let me handle it," Isaac said quietly, the weight of the decision settling in his chest. He wasn't sure if it was the cold or the strain of the day that made his bones ache, but he knew Rachel needed him to stay strong. The firewood was essential for the coming days. With the storm's fury still raging, Isaac grabbed his coat and stepped out again into the freezing landscape. The barn, which had once seemed like a place of safety, now felt more like a distant memory. He had to fight the storm, not just for warmth, but for the very sense of hope that came with survival. He fought to prove that everything he had built, the barn, the walls, the trust he'd placed in himself and his community, had a purpose. Isaac walked into the snow, which now swallowed his boots with each step. The firewood shed was several yards away, and Isaac's body protested the movement, feeling the weight of the snow pulling him down. The wind whipped fiercely, as if to mock him for every step he took. As he approached the shed, he found it buried nearly to the roof. The snow had piled up in thick layers, packing the wood inside and making it nearly impossible to access. He had no choice but to dig through it, his hands numb from the cold. It would take time, it would take effort, but Isaac understood that survival was more than effort. It was the willingness to endure. With each shovel of snow, Isaac's thoughts returned to the barn, his greatest creation and greatest worry. Would it survive? He could feel the weight of the storm in his hands. It wasn't just about sheltering the animals, it was about sheltering hope itself. As the evening set in, the work slowed, but Isaac didn't stop. He had done everything he could. The storm had come, but he hadn't given up. Not yet. The storm had not let up. In fact, it seemed to grow fiercer with each passing hour, as if nature itself had set out to test the resolve of Isaac Yoder and his family. The air outside was thick with snow, swirling in wild patterns that obscured the landscape entirely. Inside the farmhouse, the fire was the only thing that kept the darkness and cold at bay. Isaac sat by the hearth, his back aching from hours of digging through the snow, his fingers numb and stiff from the biting cold. He could feel the weight of the storm pressing against the walls of the house, the barn, and his own heart. There was no escaping it. No matter how much he had prepared, how many logs he had stacked, or how tightly he had sealed the windows, the storm had its own will. Rachel was sewing quietly at the kitchen table, the hum of the needle the only sound that filled the room. She didn't speak much, but Isaac could tell she was keeping the same careful watch over the family that she always did. Her calm, even in the face of such a storm, gave him the strength to keep moving forward. Their children played quietly in the corner, wrapped in thick wool blankets, their faces bright and full of wonder. They were oblivious to the storm, safe in the warmth of the house. Isaac could hardly believe how much had changed since the first snow fell. Just a few days ago, he had been standing in the field, hoping the barn he'd built would survive the storm. Now, it felt like the barn itself had become a symbol, a silent sentinel standing between them and the wrath of nature. Every crack in the wood, every sagging roof beam seemed to whisper a warning. Yet Isaac had done everything he could. The barn had to hold. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft crackle of the fire, and Isaac stood to check on the kettle simmering over the flames. His movements were slow, deliberate. Outside, the storm howled against the farmhouse, but Isaac felt a strange sense of peace, the kind that only comes from doing everything in your power to protect what you love. "I'll check on the barn again tomorrow," Isaac said, though his voice felt heavy. The wind outside pressed against the windows with such force that the glass rattled. He wasn't sure what more he could do, but something in his gut told him the worst was yet to come. "I just hope it's enough." Rachel didn't answer immediately. Her gaze stayed focused on her work, her needle moving smoothly through the fabric. When she finally looked up, her eyes were steady. "Isaac," she said quietly, "you've done more than enough. You've done everything you could, and we'll get through this. We always have." Isaac's heart swelled with her words. It wasn't the barn, the firewood, or the winter coats he had so carefully mended that kept him going. It was this, Rachel's unwavering faith, the steady strength of their family, and the quiet understanding that no matter how difficult the storm might be, they would endure together. The storm raged on, but inside the Yoder home there was a stillness, a strength that could not be shaken. Isaac stood by the hearth, watching the fire flicker as the wind howled outside, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. This winter, like all winters, would pass, and when it did, they would be standing. Together, as strong as the barn Isaac had built with his own hands. The first signs of spring came quietly, as all things in nature do. A soft thawing of the earth, a faint warmth in the air, and the sound of dripping water from the roof as the ice began to break free. It had been weeks since the blizzard had passed, and though the snow still covered the fields, it had started to lose its grip on the land. The storm that had held Isaac and his family captive now seemed like a distant memory. Isaac stood at the edge of the field, gazing across the land that had been so merciless in the winter months. The snow had finally begun to melt, revealing the familiar earth beneath, but there was still a chill in the air. He could feel it in his bones, the shift from winter's relentless cold to the gentle stirrings of spring. His heart was heavy with gratitude as he surveyed the damage the storm had left in its wake. The barn, which had seemed so fragile in the face of the blizzard, had withstood the storm. Its thick logs, its carefully chinked walls, and the careful planning Isaac had put into its construction had proven to be enough. The roof, although sagging under the weight of the snow, had held firm. It was still standing, though he knew the spring thaw would reveal its true condition. For now, though, it was a symbol of all the hard work, sacrifice, and faith that had gone into their survival. Rachel came up beside him, her face glowing with the fresh light of early spring. "Isaac," she said, taking his hand, "it's over. The worst is behind us." Isaac nodded, but didn't speak. Instead, he watched the landscape with a quiet sense of awe. The fields that had been hidden under a thick blanket of snow were now slowly emerging from beneath their covering. The first shoots of grass were pushing through the frozen earth, and in the distance he could see the outlines of the trees, their branches still bare, but beginning to show signs of life. There was something profoundly humbling about the changing of the seasons. It was a reminder that no matter how much they might struggle against the forces of nature, there were cycles that could not be broken. The earth would always turn, the seasons would always change, and the storms would eventually pass. "We've made it through," Isaac said finally, his voice low but filled with a quiet pride. "I wasn't sure we would, but we've made it." Rachel squeezed his hand. "We always do, Isaac, together." They stood there for a long moment, watching the land as it began to thaw, as the earth exhaled its winter breath and stretched into the light of a new season. Isaac felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that the worst had passed and that a new beginning was just on the horizon. In the coming weeks, the land would be worked again, the fields would be planted, and the barn would hold the promise of a full harvest. Isaac knew that the year ahead would bring its own challenges, its own storms. But whatever came, they would face it together. They always had. Spring had returned, and with it the promise of hope, renewal, and the quiet strength of enduring faith. The snow had finally melted, revealing the land beneath, a patchwork of brown earth and stubborn patches of white. The barn, though still standing strong, bore the weight of the storm's aftermath. Isaac had spent the past few days mending what he could, reinforcing the roof where it had buckled slightly under the pressure of the heavy snow. His hands were raw from the constant work, but the satisfaction of seeing the barn take shape again kept him moving. Each board he replaced, each log he reinforced, was an act of faith. He had learned long ago that in the life of a farmer, the work never truly stopped. Whether it was the summer heat or the biting cold of winter, there was always something to be done, something to be prepared for. And though spring had brought the promise of new beginnings, it also brought with it the burden of renewal. Isaac stood on the roof of the barn, hammer in hand, surveying the land. It was a quiet day, the kind of day that felt like the calm before a storm. There was a gentle breeze, the smell of earth and freshly turned soil hanging in the air, and the sound of birds calling overhead. The world seemed to be breathing again, as though the land itself had woken from a long, hard sleep. Rachel had begun working the garden, preparing the soil for the coming crops. She moved slowly, methodically, just as she always did, tending to each row of seeds as if each one held the promise of life itself. Isaac had never seen a woman work as she did, her hands always steady, always sure, even when the world seemed to be falling apart around her. Her faith was the bedrock on which their family stood. Isaac took a deep breath and stepped off the roof. His feet sank into the wet ground as he made his way to the barn door, his thoughts heavy with the knowledge of what lay ahead. The work of rebuilding had only just begun. There was the garden to tend, the livestock to care for, and the fields to plow. His mind raced with the tasks he knew he had to accomplish, but beneath it all, there was an undeniable feeling of hope. For the first time since the storm had started, Isaac allowed himself to relax, if only for a moment. The barn was standing, the house was warm, and his family was safe. But even as he stood there, feeling the weight of the storm's aftermath begin to lift, he knew that the hardest work was still to come. In many ways, the storm had been easier to face than the quiet challenge of renewal. It was easier to fight nature than it was to build something that could stand through both storm and calm. Isaac's thoughts turned to his father, who had always spoken of the land with reverence. "The land doesn't give up," his father had said many times. "It may take, but it always returns. Just as the seasons turn, so too does the earth renew itself." Isaac looked out over the land once more, the promise of new life stretching out before him. Renewal would come, but only if they worked for it, if they gave as much as the land had taken. And in that effort, they would find the strength to endure, not just the storm, but whatever came next. It was the end of summer when Isaac stood in the field, watching the first crops of the season begin to ripen. The work had been long, the days stretching into nights, and the labor was heavier than he ever expected. Yet there was a quiet satisfaction that came with seeing the fruits of their labor, a satisfaction that filled his chest with pride. Rachel was beside him, her hands worn from the work but still moving with the same grace and determination that she always carried. Together they had planted, harvested, and cared for everything on their land, and now it was beginning to bear the weight of their efforts. Isaac picked up an ear of corn and examined it carefully, feeling the fullness in his hands. The kernels were plump and golden, the promise of the season's hard work finally coming to fruition. He could almost taste the sweetness already, the fruit of their labor. The harvest had always been the true measure of success on the farm. It was the culmination of everything, the seed planting in the spring, the tending in the summer, and now the reaping in the fall. Rachel smiled beside him, wiping a strand of hair from her forehead. "It's going to be a good harvest," she said, her voice soft but certain. Isaac nodded, his gaze lingering on the rows of crops stretching out before him. "It will be," he agreed, though he knew there was always work to be done. The harvest was only one part of the cycle. and after the crops were gathered, there was still the preparation for the long winter months ahead. But in this moment, Isaac allowed himself to appreciate the work they had done. He could see the barn in the distance, standing tall and sturdy against the horizon, and he could feel the warmth of the house where his children were playing inside. They had made it through another season, and for now, that was enough. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden light across the field, Isaac felt a quiet peace settle over him. The storm of the past winter seemed far away now, as if it belonged to another time, another season. The harvest was not just about the crops, though. It was about the family, the faith, and the strength they had shown through every trial, big and small. It was about the quiet strength that lived in their hands and in their hearts, the kind of strength that could weather any storm, whether it came in the form of snow, wind, or doubt. And as the stars began to rise above the fields, Isaac knew that the work would never truly end. But in the quiet moments, in the warmth of the harvest, there was a sense of peace that came from knowing they had built something that could endure. They had weathered the worst, and now they stood on the other side, stronger, together, and ready for whatever the seasons would bring next. The cool breeze of autumn whispered through the trees as Isaac stood outside the barn, watching the sun sink lower in the sky. The harvest was in, the last of the crops safely stored away in the cellar, and yet there was still a quiet weight in the air. The kind of weight that only comes after a season of labor, when the ground finally rests and the work stops for a while. He had spent the better part of the last few weeks putting away the tools, mending the fences, and making sure everything was ready for the coming winter. His body ached from the constant work, but he didn't mind. It was the kind of tiredness that came with knowing he had done all he could. It was a tiredness that spoke of a life well lived, full of purpose and full of faith. Isaac glanced at Rachel, who stood on the porch watching the children play in the yard. Her face had softened with the passing seasons, and though she was no longer the young woman he had met so many years ago, there was still something about her that made his heart swell with pride. She had carried so much of the weight, too, always standing beside him, never faltering. He walked toward her, his boots crunching on the gravel. "It's done," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Another year." Rachel smiled and nodded, but there was a wistfulness in her eyes. "Yes, Isaac, another year, but this one feels different." Isaac paused, uncertain of what she meant. She didn't often speak of the passage of time in such a way. Rachel, with her quiet strength, always believed in the continuity of things, in the rhythm of the seasons, in the certainty that the work would continue no matter what. "What do you mean, Rachel?" he asked, moving closer to her. She sighed and placed a hand on his arm. "I mean, Isaac, we've lived through so much, and there will be more seasons to come, but this year we have more than just survival. We have peace. We have each other." Isaac felt the weight of her words settle into his chest. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from easy times. It was the kind of peace that came from enduring hardship and coming out the other side stronger. And it was something he never took for granted. Winter had arrived quietly, just as the land had promised. The snow covered the earth like a blanket, softening the harsh edges of the world and turning everything into a silent, white expanse. Isaac stood at the window, looking out over the field where the crops had once grown tall. Now, only the barest traces of their work remained, hidden beneath the deep snow. The world outside was still. It was the kind of stillness that allowed Isaac to reflect, to look back on all they had been through, the storms, the harvests, the long nights spent beside the fire. All had shaped them, molded them into something greater than they had been before. Isaac could feel the shift in his own heart, the quiet understanding that time was both a gift and a burden. The days passed so quickly, each one slipping into the next until seasons turned and years stacked upon one another like firewood waiting to burn. He turned from the window as Rachel entered the room, her hands holding a steaming cup of tea. She handed it to him, her smile warm and knowing. Isaac took the cup, savoring the heat that spread through his hands. "We've made it," he said softly, more to himself than to her. Rachel nodded, her gaze never leaving his face. "Yes, and we will keep making it, Isaac. Every year, every season." Isaac smiled, the weight of all that had passed and all that was yet to come settling lightly on his shoulders. There was no grand victory, no final moment where they could say they had conquered the world. But there was this, a quiet understanding that in the simplest moments they had already won. The struggle was never in the goal, but in the journey, in the willingness to keep going, no matter how hard the storm. The fire crackled softly in the corner, its warmth wrapping around them like a blanket. Outside the wind howled, but inside the Yoder home there was peace. Isaac looked at Rachel, his heart full of gratitude. The world outside was harsh, but inside they had everything they needed, each other, faith, and the strength to face whatever lay ahead. The future was unknown, but in that moment he felt ready for whatever dawned next.